The pit stop. The rain had started earlier than expected. Fat drops slapped against the windshield as the battered sedan crawled down the deserted highway. The headlights sliced through the gloom, but barely. Trees leaned menacingly toward the road, their gnarled branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. Inside the car, 4 college friends were en route to a music festival several states away. Laughter had filled the vehicle just hours ago, but the rain and creeping darkness had dampened their spirits. "I'm telling you, it's not just a myth," said Jake, gripping the steering wheel tighter. His voice cracked slightly, though he masked it with bravado. "There are stretches of road out here where people disappear, like vanish. Cars left running, doors wide open, but no one inside." "Shut the fuck up," said Lexi from the back seat, rolling her eyes but clutching her phone tighter. "You're just trying to scare us because this storm is giving you the creeps." "I'm serious," Jake replied, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "You ever hear about the pit stop murders? It was all over the news last year. Some gas station in the middle of nowhere where—" "Don't," interrupted Claire, sitting shotgun, her voice low and steady. "Not tonight, not in this weather." "Come on," said Jake, forcing a grin. "It's just a story. What are the odds we—" "Guys," muttered Mark from the back seat, his face illuminated by the dim light of his phone, "we're low on gas." The car fell silent. Jake's gaze flicked to the fuel gauge. The needle hovered precariously above empty. "Shit," he muttered. "Okay, next station we see, we're stopping." "Let's hope we see one," Lexi said, peering nervously out the rain-streaked window. The forest on either side of the road seemed to press closer, the shadows between the trees shifting unnaturally as the headlights passed. They found it 10 minutes later, a lone gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly. Lester's pit stop. The building looked ancient, the paint peeling, windows fogged with grime. A single pump stood under the canopy, its metal casing rusted and streaked with oil stains. "This looks like the start of a fucking horror movie," muttered Mark, but no one laughed. Jake pulled up to the pump and killed the engine. "Stay here," he said, grabbing his wallet. "I'll fill up." The others exchanged uneasy glances as he stepped out into the rain, pulling up his hood against the downpour. The sound of the pump starting was faintly reassuring, a sign of life in an otherwise dead stretch of road. "Doesn't feel right," Claire murmured, staring at the station through the fogged-up windshield. The fluorescent light above the entrance flickered erratically. Through the haze, she thought she saw a figure move inside, but when she blinked, it was gone. Jake returned, shaking the rain off his jacket. "Pump's working, but the card reader's busted. Gotta pay inside." "Not alone," Claire said immediately, unbuckling her seatbelt. "I'll come with you." "Suit yourself." Jake smirked, though his eyes betrayed his unease. Inside, the station was worse than it had appeared from the car. The smell of mildew hung heavy in the air, and the shelves were sparsely stocked with dust-covered snacks and expired drinks. A row of dim, buzzing lights illuminated the space, casting eerie shadows across the floor. The counter was empty. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice echoing unnaturally. From the back of the store came the sound of something metallic clattering to the ground. Claire jumped, grabbing Jake's arm. He shot her a nervous grin, but said nothing as he stepped cautiously toward the noise. "Bad idea," Claire whispered. "We should just leave." "Relax, it's probably just..." Before he could finish, the door to the back room creaked open, revealing a tall man in a grease-stained uniform. His face was partially obscured by a trucker cap, but his eyes, cold gray and utterly lifeless, sent a shiver down Claire's spine. "Help you?" the man asked, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. Jake cleared his throat. "Yeah, pump 4, $20. The man stared at him for an uncomfortably long moment before nodding and disappearing back into the darkness without a word. "I don't like this," Claire whispered again, glancing toward the door. The rain had intensified, the sound of it pounding on the roof like a drumbeat. Back in the car, Lexi and Mark were growing restless. "What the hell is taking them so long?" Lexi muttered, staring out into the rain-soaked darkness. Mark didn't respond. He was focused on something in the distance, a faint flickering light in the woods beyond the station. It moved erratically, as though someone were carrying a lantern. "You see that?" he asked, nudging Lexi. She squinted. "What the... Is that someone out there?" Before Mark could answer, the light vanished. The darkness that replaced it felt deeper, heavier. The air in the car grew suffocating. "Turn the car on," Lexi said suddenly, her voice trembling. "I don't care if we have to leave them behind. Start the fucking car." Mark reached for the keys in the ignition, but his hand froze. Through the fogged-up back window, a face was pressed against the glass. Pale, gaunt, and expressionless. "Drive!" Lexi screamed, but the face was gone before Mark could react. Inside the station, Jake and Claire were still waiting when the lights went out. "What the..." Jake began, but a sudden guttural scream from outside cut him off. "That was Lexi!" Claire shouted, grabbing Jake's arm and dragging him toward the door. When they stepped outside, the scene that greeted them was chaos. The back door of the car was wide open, rain pouring onto the empty seat. Mark was slumped over the steering wheel, blood pooling beneath him, his throat slashed open. Lexi was nowhere to be seen. "Oh my God," Claire whispered, stumbling backward. Jake turned in frantic circles, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "We have to go now. Get in the car." Claire didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the woods behind the station, where the faint light Mark had seen earlier was glowing again, brighter this time. It was accompanied by a low, droning hum that seemed to reverberate through the air, rattling her teeth. "Claire!" Jake shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the car. They didn't make it far. The sedan sputtered and died less than a mile down the road. Jake slammed his fists against the steering wheel, cursing, while Claire sobbed quietly in the passenger seat. Call for help, Jake said, fumbling for his phone. But there was no signal. The hum was louder now, closer. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. What the fuck is that? Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror where a figure was approaching. It was Lexi, or at least it looked like her. But something was wrong. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, and her eyes glowed faintly in the dark. "Let me in," she said, her voice a monotone drone. "Don't," Claire whispered, grabbing Jake's arm. "That's not her." "Let me in," Lexi repeated, louder this time. Her hand slapped against the window, leaving a bloody smear. Jake hesitated for only a moment before reaching for the door lock. As soon as the door opened, everything went black. They were found 3 days later, or what was left of them. The car was discovered abandoned on the side of the road, its interior coated in blood. Of the 4 friends, only fragments remained. Teeth, scraps of clothing, a single blood-soaked shoe. The gas station, too, was gone, as though it had never existed. Locals swore there had never been a Lester's pit stop in the area, and no records of such a place could be found. But the stories persist. Travelers who dare to take that lonely stretch of highway still report strange lights in the woods, ghostly faces in their mirrors, and an ominous hum that seems to come from nowhere. And if you stop, even for a moment, you might just vanish without a trace. So keep driving. And pray your tank doesn't run dry. The pit stop. The darkness inside the car was suffocating, a tomb of silence, except for the pattering rain and the faint, haunting hum from the woods. Jake's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, staring at Lexi's ghostly figure outside the window. Claire trembled in her seat, the whites of her eyes glaring in terror as she leaned away from the window. "Let me in," Lexi repeated, her voice distorted like a bad radio signal, broken and layered with static. Her head twitched unnaturally and her mouth stretched wider than humanly possible as she spoke. "Jake, that's not Lexi," Claire whispered fiercely, shaking his arm. Jake's breaths came in short, frantic gasps. His mind raced, the rational part of him screaming to drive away. But another part, a deeper, primal part, felt compelled to obey Lexi's voice. "Let me in!" the figure screeched, slamming her hand against the window again. This time the glass cracked, sending spiderweb fractures spiraling out. Jake snapped back to reality. "Fuck this!" he shouted, slamming his hand onto the lock button. But as he reached for the ignition, the car gave a sudden, violent jolt, as if something massive had struck it from behind. Claire screamed, spinning around to see nothing but rain-smeared darkness through the back window. "Drive, drive, goddammit!" Claire shouted, pounding on Jake's arm. "I'm fucking trying!" Jake shouted back, twisting the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered and refused to start. He tried again, harder this time, but the only response was a choking sound, as if the car itself were dying. From the corner of her eye, Claire saw something moving in the woods. Dozens of glowing orbs, no eyes, stared back at her, shifting in the shadows between the trees. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice hollow and distant. A return to the station. Jake shoved the door open. Out of the car! We have to run! Claire hesitated. Run where? Back to the station! Jake yelled, grabbing her arm and dragging her out into the rain. The moment they stepped out, the humming grew louder, reverberating through the air like a monstrous heartbeat. The two sprinted back toward Lester's pit stop, their shoes splashing in puddles that seemed to grow deeper with each step. Behind them, the shadowy figures emerged from the woods, elongated, hunched, their limbs bending at unnatural angles as they moved with horrifying speed. Claire dared a glance over her shoulder and instantly regretted it. Whatever was chasing them wasn't human. Their faces were blank, featureless ovals, their bodies warped as if made of liquid shadow. Don't look back! Jake shouted, nearly pulling Claire off her feet as he yanked her toward the station. The neon sign flickered weakly overhead as they burst through the glass door. Jake slammed it shut and locked it, though the lock seemed pitifully inadequate against whatever was outside. Inside, the store was eerily quiet, the hum now muted but still present. The shelves, once stocked with dusty goods, were now completely empty. Even the air felt wrong, thicker, heavier, as if the building itself were alive and watching them. Where's the guy? Claire gasped, clutching her chest as she scanned the empty counter. Doesn't matter, Jake said, grabbing a metal rod from a nearby shelf. We're not safe here, but at least it's shelter. Shelter? Claire snapped, her voice shrill. From what? Did you see those things? They're not going to stop. Before Jake could respond, the lights flickered and the hum surged, louder than ever. The walls of the station seemed to warp and twist, the edges of the room bending like the reflection in a funhouse mirror. Do you feel that? Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Jake nodded. He felt it in his chest, a pressure building, as if the air itself were trying to crush them. And then they heard it. A scraping sound, low and deliberate, coming from the back room. Who's there? Jake shouted, raising the metal rod like a weapon. The only response was more scraping, louder this time, accompanied by a faint, wet squelching. Claire backed away, her eyes wide. Don't go back there. We don't have a choice, Jake said, though his voice wavered. Fuck that, Claire hissed, grabbing his arm. You saw what happened outside. We stay here together. But Jake was already moving, his curiosity overriding his fear. He pushed open the door to the back room, the hinges creaking ominously. What he saw made his stomach lurch. The back room. The room was empty except for a single, blood-soaked apron hanging from a hook on the wall. Below it, the floor was slick with a dark, viscous liquid that pooled in strange, swirling patterns. The metallic scent of blood was overwhelming. What the fuck? Jake muttered, stepping closer despite himself. As he moved, the walls seemed to pulse, as if breathing. He reached out to touch one, but the moment his fingers made contact, a deafening scream erupted from the room. Jake stumbled back, clutching his ears. "Claire, get in here." "No way!" she shouted from the other side of the door. Before Jake could argue, the scream stopped as abruptly as it had started. The room fell silent, the only sound his ragged breathing. And then the humming returned, louder and more menacing than before. The descent. Claire screamed as the front door of the station shattered inward, glass spraying across the floor. The shadowy figures poured in, their featureless faces tilting unnaturally as they moved with inhuman speed. "Jake!" she screamed, pounding on the back room door. Jake burst out just as one of the creatures lunged for her. Swinging the metal rod with all his strength, he connected with its head, but the rod passed through it as if it were made of smoke. "Run!" he yelled, grabbing Claire and dragging her toward the emergency exit at the back of the store. The door led them into a narrow hallway that shouldn't have existed. The walls were lined with flickering fluorescent lights, and the floor sloped downward, the air growing colder with each step. This isn't right," Claire stammered. "Keep moving!" Jake snapped, though his own voice betrayed his terror. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the lights growing dimmer with each passing second. The humming was deafening now, a cacophony of sound that seemed to come from inside their own skulls. Finally, they reached the end of the hallway, a massive rusted door with no handle. "What now?" Claire cried, pounding on the metal. Before Jake could answer, the door swung open, revealing a cavernous space lit by a sickly green glow. The walls were covered in writing, symbols and words in a language neither of them could read. In the center of the room stood a figure, its back to them. It was the man from the gas station. "Welcome," he said without turning around, his voice echoing unnaturally. Jake raised the metal rod, but the man simply laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down their spines. "You can't fight this," the man said, turning to face them. His eyes were gone, replaced by empty black voids. "You're already part of it." The endless night hours, or maybe days later, a trucker passing through found their car. The interior was drenched in blood, but there was no sign of the friends. The gas station was gone, replaced by an empty lot overgrown with weeds. And the humming? It never stopped.